In a small, cozy study filled with books and wartime memorabilia, I sit by the window, looking out over the serene landscape, a stark contrast to the turbulent years of my youth during World War II. Here, surrounded by the quiet of rural Virginia, I often reflect on those defining years. One photograph on my desk always catches the eye, a young man in uniform beside what appears to be a tank but is in fact merely an inflatable decoy. This image often serves as a gateway to stories I tell about a different kind of warfare, one not just fought with guns and bombs, but with cunning and deception. War, as I learned it, isn't only about the physical battles. It's also a dance of shadows and misinformation. During the war, I was part of Operation Fortitude, a complex deception that ensured the success of D-Day. We created a phantom army, complete with fake tanks and false radio broadcasts, all designed to mislead the Axis powers about where the Allies would invade. Sitting here, I remember not just the strategy, but the execution, how we convinced the enemy of a lie so convincingly that they braced for an invasion at Pas de Calais, not Normandy, where we ultimately changed the course of the war. These stories, woven from the fabric of my memories, are more than historical accounts. They are lessons on the potency of intellect and the impact of human choices under immense pressure. As the twilight deepens, these reflections are a legacy of a time when information was as powerful a weapon as any artillery. In this tranquil setting, the echoes of my past are a testament to a war fought as much in the mind as on the battlefields. Hello, dear audience, and here's Harold's channel. Before we begin the story, don't forget to hit like and subscribe to our channel to receive our latest stories. Chapter 1. The Setup. As the war in Europe escalated in the early 1940s, the landscape of conflict became as much a mental as a physical battleground. From my position within the British intelligence community, based in a nondescript office in London, my days were consumed by reports, maps, and endless discussions aimed at decoding the enemy's strategies and planning our own. The constant buzz of activity was a stark reminder that information was a crucial asset, perhaps more potent than any weapon in our arsenal. The Allies, under increasing pressure to open a Western front, faced a daunting task. The Germans, well entrenched along the French coastline, had fortified their positions in anticipation of an invasion. Their Atlantic Wall, a formidable series of defenses stretching from Norway to Spain, was particularly strong at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France and Hitler's anticipated point of attack. Hitler's obsession with Pas de Calais was both a strategic intuition and a stubborn fixation. He believed, almost with a mystic certainty, that the Allies would strike there. This belief was rooted in the logical assumption given its geographical proximity to England, but it was fortified by his hubris, which made him susceptible to confirmation bias. Recognizing this, the Allied leaders devised a plan not only to outmaneuver the German defenses, but also to exploit Hitler's predictability. This was the genesis of Operation Fortitude, part of the broader bodyguard plan, which aimed to protect the real invasion site by suggesting that Pas de Calais was the target. As a young intelligence officer, I was thrust into the heart of this operation, tasked with helping to weave a web of deception so intricate that it could fool an enemy who had hitherto outplayed many others. The creation of a phantom army, the first U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, led by General George S. Patton, whom the Germans respected as an audacious tank commander, was central to Fortitude. From fake tanks constructed from rubber to wooden aircraft and bogus radio traffic, everything was designed to mimic a massive buildup of forces preparing to cross the Channel at Calais. We worked tirelessly, knowing that every detail had to be perfect. The Germans had spies, although unbeknownst to them, many had been turned by our double-cross system, feeding controlled information back to Berlin. These double agents were crucial in painting a picture of an imminent invasion at Calais. As D-Day approached, the tension within our offices grew palpable. We listened intently to intercepted communications, eager for any indication that our ruse was working. The success of the Normandy landings depended not just on the bravery of soldiers storming the beaches, but equally on our ability to keep the bulk of German forces pinned down away from the actual point of attack. Sitting at my desk late into the night, surrounded by papers and cigarette smoke, I felt the weight of our responsibility. We were not just fighting a war of arms, but a war of wits, where the battlefield was as much in the mind as it was on the ground. The outcome of this intellectual duel could determine the fate of Europe and perhaps the world. Chapter 2. The Plan. In the dimly lit rooms of the war offices, the air was often thick with smoke and the sound of rustling maps. As the date for the Allied invasion drew nearer, the work of Operation Fortitude took on a frantic, urgent pace. Our task was clear, yet complex: to convince the Axis powers that the invasion, the true turning point of the Western Front, would occur at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. Under the guise of the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, led by the formidable General George S. Patton, we orchestrated a massive deception. Patton was chosen for his notoriety. The Germans respected his military prowess and would likely believe that he would lead such a critical assault. He was, for the time being, our most visible asset, albeit in a role that was entirely fabricated. Our offices became the staging ground for what was essentially a grand theatrical production. We employed artists and designers to craft inflatable tanks and dummy aircraft. These decoys were positioned strategically around southeast England, particularly around Kent, to be visible to German reconnaissance flights. From the air, it appeared as though an immense army was gathering, poised across the Channel at the shortest point to France. Simultaneously, we amplified this illusion with a flood of counterfeit radio transmissions. Our communications teams worked in shifts, broadcasting fake operational chatter that was carefully scripted to mimic the traffic one would expect from a force preparing for a major invasion. This aspect of the plan required not only technical expertise, but also a deep understanding of military protocol and language, a challenge that was met with both anxiety and a sort of grim excitement by our team. Every detail was scrutinized for authenticity. We knew that the German intelligence service was not easily fooled, and any slip-up could have catastrophic repercussions. The double agents we controlled, turned spies who fed false information to the Germans, were invaluable in this effort. They confirmed the misleading signals we broadcasted, weaving a consistent narrative of an imminent invasion at Calais. Among these agents was Garbo, a code name for Juan Pujol Garcia, a Spaniard who had become one of our most effective double agents. Posing as a pro-Nazi sympathizer, Garbo managed to establish a network of fictitious sub-agents who supposedly gathered intelligence across Britain. His reports, which were eagerly consumed by the Abwehr, the German military intelligence, were fabrications that reinforced the false notion of FUSAG's activities and intentions. As part of these elaborate preparations, I found myself often liaising with members of the Special Operations Executive, SOE, and the newly formed Special Air Service, SAS. These interactions were focused on coordinating smaller, yet significant sabotage operations across Europe that would indirectly support the notion of Calais as the invasion target. By disrupting German communications and transport lines in areas away from Normandy, we aimed to further confound the enemy's ability to discern our true intentions. Throughout this intense period, the burden of secrecy weighed heavily on all involved. We lived double lives, and the stress of maintaining this facade was palpable. Every casual conversation, even those away from the office, had to be guarded, as the walls had ears, and the stakes were immeasurably high. As D-Day approached, the pace became nearly unbearable. We worked against the clock, under the constant threat of discovery. Yet, amidst the tension, there was a bond that formed among us, a shared commitment to the cause and a mutual respect for the gravity of our task. This camaraderie was, perhaps, the only solace during those critical days, as we awaited the dawn of June 6, 1944, hoping that our efforts would tip the scales in favor of the Allied forces. Chapter 3. The Deception Deepens. As the spring of 1944 blossomed into early summer, the branches of Operation Fortitude grew ever more intricate. Our offices, already a labyrinth of secrecy and tension, became the very heartbeat of the Allied deception efforts. Every action, every report, was a calculated measure to enhance the illusion that Pas-de-Calais was the intended site for the Allied invasion. The Allied command had designated Normandy as the true invasion point, but this knowledge was safeguarded with the utmost secrecy. Only a handful of us were privy to the complete picture, understanding both the real and the fabricated strategies. This dual awareness was a heavy burden, as any leak could jeopardize the entire operation and countless lives. During this critical phase, our work with double agents intensified. The information they relayed to their German handlers was a mixture of truth and fiction, carefully crafted to mislead without arousing suspicion. These agents, once threats, had become some of our most valuable assets. Their reports were corroborated by the staged activities we meticulously set up across southeastern England. One particular day stood out vividly in my memory. We received word that German reconnaissance planes had been spotted over the area where our dummy tanks and planes were positioned. The atmosphere in the office was electric with a mix of anxiety and anticipation. We needed those images, captured from their aerial surveys, to convince the German High Command that an invasion force was indeed massing in Kent. Meanwhile, our efforts extended beyond physical and human deception. The Royal Air Force played a critical role in Operation Titanic, a sub-operation of Fortitude. They dropped scores of dummy parachutists across different parts of northern France. These decoys were equipped with recorded sounds of gunfire and exploding grenades, played from loudspeakers to simulate the noise of an active battlefield. The objective was clear: to suggest airborne landings and confuse German forces about the scope and scale of the Allied operations. At the intelligence office, we monitored intercepted German communications to gauge their response. It was a surreal experience to listen in, knowing that each piece of intercepted dialogue could hint at whether our ruse was succeeding. The tension was palpable. We lived moment to moment, each one potentially bringing either validation of our efforts or signs of their unraveling. One evening, gathered around a radio set, we listened as German operators discussed the increased Allied activity. Their conversation was cautious, analytical. They noted the unusual spike in radio chatter and the sightings of parachute drops. It was exactly the kind of reaction we had hoped for, yet hearing it unfold in real time was both thrilling and terrifying. As June began, the final elements of our plan were set into motion. Fake field orders and battle plans were accidentally lost in places where German spies could easily discover them. These documents were detailed and convincingly authentic, describing a massive attack at Calais, scheduled for late June. To complement this, our controlled double agent sent urgent, encrypted messages to their handlers. These messages were designed to be intercepted and decrypted quickly, offering the Germans just enough time to react before the real D-Day. This last push was risky. It required precise timing and absolute secrecy from everyone involved. The culmination of these efforts came as we drew closer to the actual D-Day. On June 5th, I stayed late in the office, the maps of France spread before me, tracing the paths that would soon be taken by real soldiers. That night, I wrote a letter to a friend, not mentioning the details, but reflecting on the importance of hope and the belief in the value of our cause. As the clock struck midnight, marking the arrival of June 6, 1944, our role shifted dramatically. The deception had been laid. Now it was up to the soldiers, sailors, and airmen to make the ultimate push. We stood back, our tools of war having been words and illusions, and watched as the real battle to liberate Europe began. Chapter 4. On the Eve of Battle. As the final hours before D-Day dwindled, the atmosphere in the intelligence office reached a crescendo of silent tension and focused preparation. Every member of our team was acutely aware of the gravity of what the next day would bring. We had laid the groundwork for one of the largest amphibious military assaults in history, and while our soldiers prepared to storm the beaches of Normandy, our role shifted to vigilant observation and last-minute adjustments to our deceptive tapestry. The night of June 5th was a flurry of activity. Our communications team was tasked with broadcasting a final series of misleading signals and movements to solidify the Germans' belief in an imminent attack at Pas-de-Calais. This included coordinating with the Royal Navy to simulate noise and radio traffic that mimicked the movements of a large fleet heading towards Calais. Every detail had to suggest that Normandy was merely a diversion, a feint to draw German forces away from the real target. Amidst these activities, I found myself drawn to the large, detailed maps plastered across the walls of our operations room. These maps were no longer just charts. They were the narrative of countless lives about to be thrust into the crucible of war. Each mark and notation represented a segment of the grand strategy upon which the fate of Europe hinged. As midnight approached, the final reports from our double agents were received with both relief and a lingering anxiety. Garbo, our most prolific double agent, had sent a message earlier in the day, which was confirmed to have been received by German intelligence. His message reinforced the illusion of a large-scale buildup at Dover, suggesting that the Allied forces were poised to strike at Pas-de-Calais within the next 48 hours. The real invasion force, meanwhile, was stealthily approaching the Normandy coast. The men aboard those ships carried with them the hopes and fears of a world weary from years of relentless warfare. As an intelligence officer, I knew the beaches they were headed towards. Omaha, Utah, Gold, Juno, and Sword would soon be etched into the annals of history, either as sites of tragic loss or incredible heroism, or perhaps both. Throughout the night, I and a few colleagues remained in constant contact with the Allied command units. We were ready to provide any last-minute intelligence that might assist the landing forces. Our efforts were now solely focused on ensuring that the Germans remained oblivious to the true scale of the operation unfolding towards Normandy. As dawn broke on June 6, 1944, the office was eerily quiet. The bulk of our work was done, and the success of Operation Fortitude, for now, seemed assured. We gathered around the radio, listening to the crackled reports coming in from the front lines. Initial reports were fragmented, but indicated that the landings had begun. The wait was excruciating. Each report from the front was parsed for any indication of how the landings were being received and whether the German forces had indeed been fooled by our deception. It was a surreal feeling to know that while the fate of the war was being decided on those beaches, our battlefield had been the airwaves and the minds of the enemy commanders. As confirmed reports of successful landings began to trickle in, a cautious optimism took hold among us. The beaches were being secured, and it appeared that the majority of the German forces were still held in reserve at Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. Operation Fortitude had played its part in securing this initial advantage. On that historic morning, as the scale of the unfolding battle became clearer, we understood that our role in this pivotal chapter of the war was diminishing. The deception had worked. Now it was up to the brave men on the ground to carry forward the banner we had helped to unfurl so covertly. The emotion in the room was a complex tapestry of relief, pride, and a somber respect for the immense challenges and sacrifices that lay ahead on the road to victory. Chapter 5. D-Day unfolds. June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, marked a turning point in World War II. Our office, usually abuzz with the clacking of typewriters and low murmur of strategy discussions, was subdued, its usual frenzy replaced by a tense anticipation as we awaited updates from the front lines. The success of our deceptive tactics with Operation Fortitude now lay in the hands of those executing the direct assault on Normandy's shores. Throughout the morning, the first fragmented reports trickled in over the radio, each piece of communication dissected for indications of the effectiveness of our months of planning and deception. As an intelligence officer, hearing the coded confirmations of beach landings felt surreal, each code word signifying a different segment of the beach secured by Allied troops. The room filled with a mix of relief and concern, as initial reports indicated heavy resistance at Omaha Beach. The stark contrast between the chaos described in these dispatches and the clinical, detached coordinates on our maps was jarring. It underscored the distance between our strategized deceptions and the brutal realities faced by soldiers on the ground. Meanwhile, we kept a keen eye on German communications, intercepts showing confusion and delayed responses. It became increasingly clear as the day progressed that our efforts to pin down German forces at Pas-de-Calais were bearing fruit. The German High Command, still convinced that another, larger invasion could be imminent at Calais, hesitated to redeploy their forces to Normandy. This delay was critical and allowed the Allied forces to establish a stronger foothold. Every hour gained through confusion and indecision in the German ranks translated into lives saved and strategic advantages gained on the beaches. By midday, the scope of the operation began to dawn on everyone in the room. Reports of paratroopers securing bridges and towns inland, coupled with the consolidation of beachheads, painted a picture of a well-oiled machine, each cog, the paratroopers, infantry, and armored divisions, playing its part flawlessly, albeit at a great cost. In the midst of monitoring enemy communications, we also managed secure lines to our field operatives, who confirmed the massive movement of resources and reinforcements making their way through the secured beachheads towards the French interior. The scale of logistics involved, from men and ammunition to food and medical supplies, was staggering and spoke to the immense planning that had preceded this day. As the afternoon turned to evening, the office did not slow down. We began to shift our focus towards supporting the continued push inland, ensuring that the still deceived German forces at Pas-de-Calais would not be redeployed in time to make a significant difference. The ongoing deception operations, although reduced in intensity, remained crucial. The fake radio traffic, now a well-oiled routine, continued to broadcast hints of an impending secondary invasion. Reflecting on the day's events in the quiet of the late evening, I felt a profound mix of emotions. Pride in the success of our deceptive strategies was tempered by the sobering reports of casualties and the stark heroism of those who had stormed the beaches. The reality of war, with all its brutality and complexity, had never been clearer. As D-Day drew to a close, the maps on our walls, once just tools in our elaborate game of deceit, had transformed. They were now records of a real and bloody struggle that had shifted the balance of the war. Our role as intelligence officers had been pivotal in securing this day, but the true burden had been borne by the men and women who fought and died on those beaches. Their courage ensured that our shadows of deception turned into tangible strides towards victory. Chapter 6. The Aftermath. The days following D-Day were a blur of activity and tension. Our office, having played a crucial role in one of the largest military deceptions in history, now shifted its focus to support the ongoing battle and manage the fallout of our deception. The invasion of Normandy was only the beginning, and the weeks that followed would prove critical in determining the outcome of our efforts. The initial success at Normandy meant that the Allied forces could establish a firm foothold in France, but it also required a swift adaptation to the evolving battlefield dynamics. As the German forces began to realize the full scope of the Allied landings, their command structure struggled with confusion and disbelief, still partly clinging to the deception that another major attack might occur at Pas-de-Calais. Within our operations room, the walls were lined with updated maps and charts, tracking the movements of both Allied and German forces. The tension was palpable as we monitored the slow and costly progress through the French countryside. The bocage, with its dense hedgerows and narrow lanes, presented a formidable challenge, turning every mile gained into a hard-fought victory. My role involved continued management of misinformation, ensuring that the German forces remained divided and unable to mount a cohesive counterattack. Each day brought new challenges as we adapted our strategies to the changing conditions on the ground. We sustained the narrative of potential further landings at Pas-de-Calais, keeping several German divisions tied down, awaiting an invasion that would never come. During this time, the importance of communication became ever more apparent. We kept in close contact with field operatives who provided real-time intelligence, crucial for adjusting our strategies. This information not only influenced military tactics, but also helped us manage the delicate balance of keeping our own forces informed without leaking sensitive information to the enemy. As reports of Allied advances and German retreats came in, a cautious optimism began to spread through the office. However, each report of an Allied victory was tempered by the heavy cost in human lives. The reports from field hospitals were grim, detailing the sacrifices made by those fighting on the front lines. It was a stark reminder of the brutal reality of war, far removed from the strategic maps and coded messages that filled our days. Amidst the strategic victories and logistical challenges, personal stories of bravery and loss also reached us. One particularly poignant account was that of a company of paratroopers who had held a key bridge against overwhelming odds, ensuring the success of surrounding operations. Such stories were common, each underscoring the courage and determination of the Allied forces. As the weeks passed, the full impact of Operation Fortitude and the Normandy landings became clear. We had successfully breached Hitler's fortress Europe, and while the road ahead remained fraught with difficulty and danger, the initial successes at Normandy had given the Allies a vital foothold. Reflecting on the whirlwind of those days, I felt a complex mix of pride and sorrow. Pride in the ingenuity and success of our operations, and profound sorrow for the immense cost at which these successes had come. The war was far from over, but the events of June 1944 had shifted its course irrevocably. In the quiet moments late at night, I often found myself pondering the broader implications of our actions. The deceptions and strategies we employed were not just tactical maneuvers, but also significant ethical undertakings. Each decision, each piece of misinformation, had far-reaching consequences, affecting thousands of lives. These reflections were a reminder of the heavy responsibilities we bore, not just as soldiers and strategists, but as guardians of the values we fought to preserve. Chapter 7: Victory and Reflection. As summer turned to autumn in 1944, the Allied forces continued their push through occupied Europe, each mile reclaimed marking both progress and profound sacrifice. Back at the intelligence office, the frenetic pace of the initial D-Day aftermath had settled into a sustained effort to support ongoing military operations and manage the strategic implications of our earlier deception efforts. The success of Operation Fortitude had been a textbook example of military strategy and deception at its finest. But the ongoing war presented new challenges daily. German forces, though initially confused and misdirected, began adapting to the Allied presence, necessitating continuous adjustments on our part. During this period, my role shifted increasingly towards analyzing intercepted communications and overseeing the continued use of double agents. We worked to maintain the illusion of potential Allied operations in other regions, which helped to keep German resources stretched thin across multiple fronts. This not only facilitated our advances, but also hindered the enemy's ability to consolidate and counterattack effectively. Our team also started to focus on post-war planning. The concept of winning the war was no longer a distant dream, but a tangible goal. Discussions often revolved around the shape of Europe after the fall of the Nazi regime. These conversations were weighted with the knowledge that our actions would help shape the coming peace and the new world order. Reflecting on the months since D-Day, I felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. The constant pressure to perform at the highest levels, knowing that any mistake could cost lives, was draining. Yet there was also a deep sense of accomplishment in knowing that our efforts had contributed significantly to the Allied successes. Personal reflections during this time often brought me back to the ethical dimensions of our work. Deception, a tool so vital to our successes, posed moral questions that were not easily answered. Had we, in deceiving the enemy, crossed lines that should not have been crossed? Or was the moral calculus of war such that any action that reduced overall suffering was justified? These questions became even more pressing as reports of liberated concentration camps began to filter back to us. The sheer scale of the atrocities underscored the necessity of our fight against the Axis powers. Each piece of intelligence that led to the saving of lives or the hastening of the war's end seemed to affirm our course of action, yet the weight of what was necessary to achieve these ends was heavy. As victory in Europe appeared increasingly inevitable, celebrations were tempered by the awareness of the cost at which it had come. The streets of London, filled with jubilant crowds, were a stark contrast to the somber reflections within our office walls. We understood better than most that each cheer for victory was echoed by a silent prayer for those lost. In the final days of the European conflict, my thoughts often turned to the future. What role would intelligence play in a peacetime world? How would the alliances formed in the heat of battle transition into the politics of peace? And personally, what would life hold after years consumed by war? These reflections were interrupted by the news of VE Day, the official end of the war in Europe. It was a day of profound joy and relief, but also a moment of deep contemplation. As we celebrated, I knew that the end of the war did not mean the end of our responsibilities. The world we had fought for was waiting to be rebuilt, shaped by the peace that followed the victory we had helped secure. The legacy of our actions, woven through the fabric of this new world, would be our truest test. Decades have passed since the lights of war dimmed across Europe, and the world moved forward into periods of both tension and peace. As an old man now, far removed from the clandestine operations and secret strategizing of the intelligence service during World War II, I find the memories of those years both a burden and a beacon. Sitting in the quiet of my study, surrounded by books and the various artifacts of a long career, I often reflect on the legacy of our actions. The walls are adorned with framed maps and photographs, each a frozen moment from a time when every decision could mean life or death for thousands. These are not just memorials of past glories, but reminders of the weighty responsibilities that came with our duties. Now, as a grandfather, I take every opportunity to teach my grandchildren about the complexities of war. They listen, wide-eyed, as I speak not of heroism and victory alone, but of the moral dilemmas and the personal costs of conflict. It is important to me that they understand war through the lens of both its necessity and its grave consequences. I tell them about Operation Fortitude, not just as a tale of successful deception, but as a story of human ingenuity and ethical challenge. I explain how we crafted a reality so convincing that it saved countless lives by misdirecting the enemy, yet required us to manipulate truth in ways that were not always comfortable. In public talks and memoirs, I have tried to convey the lessons of those years: the importance of intelligence in warfare, the critical role of information and misinformation, and the overarching need for vigilance in peace as much as in war. These discussions often lead to broader reflections on the nature of truth and the responsibilities of those who wield it. My experiences have also led me to advocate for peace and reconciliation. Having seen the cost of war firsthand, I work with various organizations to promote understanding and dialogue between former enemies. The world has changed dramatically since the 1940s, but the need for cooperation and mutual understanding remains constant. As I grow older, my hope is to leave behind a legacy that values peace and wisdom over conflict and triumph. The decorations and medals in my study gather dust, but the memories they represent spur me to continue sharing our history. It is a history not just of a war won, but of lessons learned and the perpetual hope that such lessons guide us in avoiding future conflicts. In quiet moments, looking out over a peaceful garden, I am grateful for the life I have lived and the opportunity to influence how the next generation perceives our shared past. In these young minds, I see the promise of a future where history's lessons are remembered and its mistakes are not repeated. My role in the war, once defined by secrecy and shadows, now lives on in the light of education and openness, a testament to the enduring power of truth in shaping the world for the better. Thank you all for listening to the entire story. Please leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your feedback is an inspiration for the channel to grow. Goodbye for now, and see you again soon.